In the summer of 1930, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien first scribbled down the sentence, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And from that sentence came the first published exploration into the world of Middle-earth. The Hobbit introduced us to dwarves and wizards and elves, and one elf in particular, who this video is all about. But honestly, in The Hobbit, the Elven King of Mirkwood is hardly a breakout character. I mean, he's an important obstacle in the quest of Erebor, he imprisons the dwarves for trespassing, and he does eventually help out in the climactic battle of the Five Armies, but beyond that, the Elven King is just some Elven King. He's not even afforded the distinction of a name, and for 24 years, that's all he was. But then The Lord of the Rings was published, and all of a sudden, not only does the Elven King get a name, he also gets a son, an important son, and an important role in the War of the Ring. But his past was still shrouded in mystery. In fact, it wasn't until 50 years after the Elven King first appeared on the pages of The Hobbit that his origins were finally revealed in the unfinished tales. So, today we are going to explore the life of Thranduil and try to understand who he was before and after the events of The Hobbit. Alla Tulia Meldonia Aharamari Essay, my name's Rainbow Dave and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled lore video. So, the earliest origins of Thranduil do remain a bit of a mystery. Tolkien gives us no date for the year of his birth, but even the most conservative estimate would definitely place Thranduil in the category of very old by the time of The Lord of the Rings. It's possible, perhaps even probable, that he was born as long ago as the end of the First Age, although the earliest chronological mention of him states that he was a respected elven prince in the early centuries of the Second Age. And I can't really talk about the early life of Thranduil without mentioning his father, Orather, the grandfather of Legolas. Now, Orather, and potentially, probably, Thranduil too, were Sindar elves, grey elves, not as mighty as the Noldor, but mightier than the woodland-dwelling Sylvan. And this distinction between the different types of elves is important, but it's something that I go into a lot more detail on in this video, so check that out after this if you're interested. I'll put a link in the description below. Anyway, because they are Sindar, Orather and Thranduil are dark elves. And for reasons that I'll talk about in future videos, they don't have the friendliest relationship with the High Elven Noldor, who they share a home with in the early Second Age. And so, Orather eventually takes his son Thranduil and a good number of his Sindar people, and they migrate over the Misty Mountains and into the east, where they eventually come to settle in the vast Greenwood, which of course will later be known as Mirkwood. And initially, Orather's woodland realm is huge. It extends all the way from the northern Greenwood right the way down to his capital, which was an elven stronghold on a hill called Amon Lank. Now, to be honest, we aren't told a huge much more about what Thranduil got up to throughout the rest of the Second Age. We know that he and his father kind of went native, to be honest, and began adopting the languages and the customs of the rustic Sylvan elves that they ruled over, and we also know that at some point Thranduil must have taken a wife, as we know Legolas must have had a mother, but the truth is we know absolutely nothing about her. The Hobbit movies give us a few lines of dialogue on the subject, but that's entirely made up by the screenwriters. Tolkien told us nothing about Thranduil's wife. And for all we know, she may very well still be alive in the story. I mean, it's true, she's not mentioned in The Hobbit, but neither is Legolas. So perhaps both of them were just off somewhere doing something else. We just don't know. And another thing that we simply do not know is when Thranduil's son was born. Or even if Legolas was Thranduil's only child. Curiously, Legolas is one of the only major characters in The Lord of the Rings whose date of birth is not given. And thus we have pretty much no idea how old he is. There are references in the Two Towers that suggest he must be at least 500 years old, but it's up to the theatre of our collective imaginations to decide whether Legolas is a young elf, only a few hundred years old, or some kind of ancient being born thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, perhaps even in the Second Age. And does he have any siblings? Well, I don't know. Honestly, that's up to you guys to decide too. But anyway, getting back to Thranduil, as he is the actual focus of this video, the next big event in his life comes right at the end of the Second Age, and I think it's fair to say that this is one of the most significant and life-changing things ever to happen to Thranduil. You see, despite their, let's say, disharmony, right at the end of the Second Age, Orifer and Thranduil do reunite with the High Elven Noldor, under their High King, Gil-galad. And they do so in order to challenge Sauron, and to defeat him in the War of the Last Alliance. However, although we all know that the Last Alliance was ultimately victorious, their win comes at a very high cost. And that cost is felt especially dearly by Thranduil. So, along with many of their elven warriors from Mirkwood, Orifer and Thranduil march with the army of Gil-galad, and they arrive at the plain of Dagorlad to assault Mordor in the War of the Last Alliance. Now, as we all know, this battle is a victory for the Free Peoples, but it is a bit of a disaster for the elves under Orifer. And to be 100% honest, without wanting to be found guilty of victim blaming, it is kind of Orifer's fault. So Tolkien tells us that although the elves of Mirkwood were hardy and valiant, they were also ill-equipped with armour or weapons in comparison with the Eldar of the West, aka the High Elves of Gil-galad. Now, that's obviously not Orifer's fault, but we're also told their losses were thus more grievous than they need have been. So, in the Battle of Dagorlad, which is the first great assault upon Mordor, Orifer and his elves were not disposed to place themselves under the supreme command of Gil-galad. Now, I guess I could understand this if Gil-galad was some kind of tyrannical warlord, but he's really not. By all accounts, Gil-galad is a wise and greatly respected king. He's a wonderful dude, which makes me think Orifer's inability to play well with others boils down to pride. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Either way, we're told that Orifer rushed forward at the head of his most doughty warriors before Gil-galad had given the signal for the advance. And as you can probably predict, that did not go well. Tolkien tells us that Orifer was slain in the first assault upon Mordor, and his army took massive casualties. We know that Thranduil of course survived, but when the war was ended and Sauron was slain, sort of, Thranduil returned to his dead father's kingdom with barely a third of the army that had marched to war. The Battle of Dagorlad was devastating for the elves of the Woodland Realm, and I think an immensely traumatic event for Thranduil. We'll see this as the Third Age progresses, that Thranduil is never truly free from the ordeal that the War of the Last Alliance put him through. And of course, with his father dead, Thranduil must now advance from the role of prince to king. Now, throughout the early years of the Third Age, Thranduil's life does once again become a bit of a mystery. But we see that his experiences of war really do affect his decisions as king. So I said a few minutes ago that the realm of Orifer was vast and it extended all the way to his capital of Amon-Lanc, but under Thranduil, the Woodland Kingdom shrinks significantly. Over the centuries, Thranduil withdraws further and further and further north, away from the dreaded south, away from the ghosts of the Last Alliance. But I don't want to imply these are just the actions of some paranoid ruler. Remember, 2/3 of the Sylvan army were wiped out, and so the Woodland Realm in the Third Age was massively depopulated. And, on top of that, by the end of the first millennium of the Third Age, Greenwood the Great was beginning to become infected with the shadows of evil things. We all know, of course, that Sauron was not utterly destroyed in the War of the Last Alliance, and by the year 1000 of the Third Age, he was strong enough to return. And of all the places Sauron could have chosen for his return, he chose the Greenwood, which, thanks to him, under the guise of the Necromancer, soon became known as Mirkwood. And just to add insult to injury, and also to justify Thranduil's fear of the south, Sauron chose as his new stronghold the old capital of Oriphar's realm, Amon Lanc. The hill was conquered and corrupted and converted into an evil place that all of us are going to be familiar with. Dol Guldur, the Hill of Dark Sorcery. And look, I certainly don't want to go diagnosing the psychological ailments of a fictional character, although I am not qualified to do that, but I do think Thranduil seems to exhibit some symptoms of what I guess we would call post-traumatic stress. Tolkien even tells us that there was in Thranduil's heart a still deeper shadow. He had seen the horror of Mordor and could not forget it. If ever he looked south, its memory dimmed the light of the sun. And though he knew that it was now broken and deserted, fear spoke in his heart that it was not conquered forever. It would rise again. So, I guess it's very easy to think of Thranduil as just a haughty elf who doesn't care much for other peoples, but I actually think there's a whole lot more to his psychology than that. More so than most elves of the Third Age, Thranduil is really damaged by his experiences of war. However, despite Thranduil's tactical retreat behind the Forest River, and despite his delving of underground halls far away from the shadow of the Necromancer, Thranduil's kingdom is not actually as isolationist as it is sometimes thought to be. I mean, I used to think of Thranduil's kingdom as being like some super secretive realm that's totally separate from the rest of northeastern Middle-earth, but honestly, that is simply not the case in Tolkien's writing. Now, Lothlorien, for example, that is an isolationist elven realm. Those guys hardly interact with anyone outside their borders. Rivendell too, to a bit of a lesser extent, they are secretive and they generally do keep to themselves. But Thranduil's realm is actually one of the most cosmopolitan elven kingdoms ever to exist. We know that from Mirkwood came the Raft Elves, who had frequent dealings with the Lake Men of Esgaroth, which is also known as Lake Town. And we also know that Thranduil imports his wine all the way from Dorwinion, which is an incredibly long way away. Thranduil's halls, they're all the way up here, and Dorwinion is all the way over by the Sea of Rhûn. Crazy! Also, in days gone by, we know that the Woodland Realm traded with the Men of Dale and the Dwarves of Erebor. So I do want to challenge this misconception that the Elves of Mirkwood are like super secretive and isolationist. In reality, they are anything but. And I think the prosperity of Thranduil's realm is made even more impressive by the fact that it is the only elven kingdom of the Third Age that is at no point in its history ever protected by an elven ring of power. You know, I don't want to be rude, but Thranduil is just a dark elf, alright? He's not as ancient as Círdan of the Grey Havens, and he's not as mighty as Galadriel, and he's certainly not as wise as Elrond. Yet, in spite of that, Thranduil rules a thriving realm for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Although, I must say, as much as I do enjoy Thranduil's character, it would be a little bit biased of me to suggest that he's like some perfect guy who never does anything wrong, because if Thranduil has a weakness, it is greed. In fact, Tolkien himself pretty much says exactly that in The Hobbit. If the Elf King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems, and though his hoard was rich, he was eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. And this lust for wealth leads us, of course, to the Battle of the Five Armies. For until the orcs and wolves show up and the 3 armies become the 5 armies, this is a conflict that's all about staking a claim over treasure. But the truth is, to be honest, I reckon you guys already know about the Battle of the 5 Armies, and although that battle is the most famous one to involve Thranduil, there is another that I think is much more significant to his character and to his character arc. So, on March the 15th, in the year 3019 of the Third Age, the Battle of Pelennor Fields was fought outside the walls of Minas Tirith, and you guys definitely know all about that. However, on the exact same day, there began a lesser-known conflict that took place beneath the trees of Mirkwood. And this long battle began when Carmul, one of the Ringwraiths, second in command of the Ringwraiths, sent an army of orcs from Dol Guldur to invade the realm of Thranduil. And so, this marks the first time in over 3,000 years that Thrandwheel is truly forced to reckon with his trauma from the past, and to overcome his fear of Sauron. And in this battle, Thranduil does just that. We aren't given too many details, but we do know that after a long battle under the trees and great ruin of fire, Thranduil had the victory. And this brings us to a really happy ending for Thranduil's character. So, at the same time as his realm came under attack from Dol Guldur, so too did Lothlorien come under attack. In fact, Lothlorien was attacked 3 times. But eventually, Celeborn, the husband of Galadriel, also led his elves to victory. And 3 days after Sauron's final destruction, after the destruction of his ring, Galadriel came to Dol Guldur, and she cleansed it of all the lingering evil. And so, Thranduil's final chronological mention in the Legendarium comes on the Elven New Year, when his army meets the army of Celeborn, and the 2 great Sindarin lords unite in the midst of Mirkwood. And with Sauron now utterly defeated and his Nazgul gone and his armies scattered, Thranduil and Celeborn rename Mirkwood Erin Las Galan, the Wood of Green Leaves. Celeborn, he claims the southern part of the forest, which becomes afterwards known as East Lorien. The middle part, that's between the East Bight and the Woodland Realm, that was gifted to the Beornings, the skin changers of Beorn's people, as well as the woodsmen, the mortal men that live in Mirkwood. And Thranduil's kingdom was extended all the way to the mountains of Mirkwood, which effectively doubles the size of his realm. And we're explicitly told that as the Fourth Age began, in the Greenwood, the woodland elves remained untroubled, potentially forever after. And so finally, this brings us to Thranduil's fate after the destruction of the ring. So on the one hand, there's not really much to say. Thranduil's fate is, shock, a mystery. But there is room for us to speculate. Because we know that at the end of the Third Age, Thranduil was not amongst the elves that sailed west with Galadriel and Elrond and the other ring-bearers. Now, he wasn't the only elven lord to remain in Middle-earth into the Fourth Age. We know that Celeborn also remained for a while, along with his grandsons Eladan and Elrohir. But we also know that Celeborn did soon grow weary of ruling in Lothlorien, and he eventually travelled to Rivendell before he too departed Middle-earth with his kinsman Círdan the Shipwright. However, we are given no indication that Thranduil ever chose to do the same. And if he didn't, if Thranduil remained the king of the Woodland Realm long after Celeborn and Círdan's departure, then he would perhaps be one of the oldest beings left in Middle-earth. it's quite cool to speculate that long into the Fourth Age, when the dominion of men is in full swing, there might still be some vestige of the elder days lingering on in Thranduil. Perhaps even in an age where magic has diminished, there is still an Elven King living deep within the forest of green leaves. Anyway, guys, that is the tale of Thranduil, but before I finish this video, I do just want to let you know that the next video I release will be the first in a new series, continuing the stories of the First Age. And the reason I mention this is because the first video in that series is going to be all about the ancient Dark Elves of the Elder Days, and a lot of that is going to be quite relevant to what I just talked about in this video. In fact, whilst Tolkien was writing about the Elven King way back in the 1930s, decades before Thranduil was even a name known to anyone, the Elven King's character was partly inspired by another great Elven King of the Legendarium. An Elven King who's even more powerful and even more ancient than Thranduil. His name was Eleuthingol, and his kingdom is the same place where Thranduil's father, Oropher, once lived. So, if you've always wanted to learn more about the First Age and the epic tales told in the Silmarillion, make sure that you stay tuned for this upcoming series. And if you're new to the channel, or if you've just not watched any of my First Age videos, I would recommend giving them a watch before I upload the new series, just because my next video will kind of continue a story that I've already spent 10 videos kind of beginning and telling. And I don't want you guys to miss out on the beginning of that. So, if you're not familiar, or if you simply want a recap, then check out my first 4 videos on the beginning of days, which tells the earliest history of Arda and the origins of all the Elven clans, and also check out my 6-part series about the mightiest elf ever to live, Feanor, the maker of the Silmarils, the uncle of Galadriel, and one of the most important characters in all of Tolkien's Legendarium. But anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like and a comment, and be sure to hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss what's coming soon. And as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.